Hello, good evening, welcome. Uh, this evening, I'll be hosting Nuri Sherif. We'll be here talking about the gay agenda is the title of this presentation. And the reason why Nuri is here to talk to us is because they are a public historian, somebody who has a background in history specifically and is currently pursuing law. And I wanted to invite them to talk to you today to explain a little bit about ethical historical storytelling and what that means, why it's important to think about the context in which we tell history and what it is to be the person presenting that information. So I thought I would hand things off to you by letting you explain a little bit about what public history is or what you think it means to be a public historian.
Incredible. A super easy question to start. So, public history is, hi, thank you for having me, by the way. Public history is a really nebulous concept, I think, and a really nebulous discipline because it can mean so many things. So the way that I fumble through describing it to people is that it teaches folks how to be the translator of history that is produced in the academy to the people. So like your, World War II loving uncle or whatever the heck person. So how do we bring the concepts and the research that's happening in universities and tell that to people who visit museums and parks and things like that? And public historians can do any manner of jobs and things like that. Some of the more traditional ones are like curators, so the people who make exhibits. You go to the museum, curator did that thing. Collections managers, and they are the people who get the things for the curators to put on display. Historic preservationists who like make sure that crumbly buildings don't fall down or analyze paint. There was really cool paint analyst. That was neat. All sorts of things can encompass public history. Specifically, I've done curatorships and have been an editor for a blog on history. And I was also a park ranger for a little bit. Easily coolest job I've ever had. So if you just want to talk about the Park Service, let me know. Yeah, so that's, I would say, what public history is, and also it's more. I think you're muted.
Thank you. To kind of get this started, I wanted to ask you about how do you think about the presentation of history? And I know you have some stuff you're going to talk about specifically regarding sort of the history of LGBTQIA queer rights throughout the last century and a half or longer. So I guess to get into that, I kind of wanted to ask you about how you think about the presentation of history as somebody who's done this as a national park ranger, or somebody who's worked with the public to explain some of these things to them that they may have no familiarity with at all. And I imagine that when you would see people at the national park that you worked at, there were often people who had no idea what they were looking at or the relevance of it. So, what do you think about some of those things?
Yeah, so I think there are a few questions in there. First, I worked at Harper's Ferry, which is a little town in West Virginia. And it is also, fun fact, kind of the midway point on the Appalachian Trail. So we actually got a lot of people who were through hikers who just like stumbled into this town because they had to, because it's what they were doing all summer was hiking. And they're like, oh shit, what is this? Turns out it's a little historic town. And what do I think about the presentation of history? So that's a very big question, and I don't think it's specific enough for me to actually give you an answer. What do you mean by that? By the presentation of history by the federal government? Because part of what I was doing had to be in line with the federal government. So like their official stance on the cause of the Civil War, which is slavery. And of course, with a Civil War site, you have a lot of like lost causers come by and try to tell you you're wrong, which is always fun. And also like just the presentation of information. It's about history or not about history. Like you always have to keep in mind who you're presenting it on behalf of. So like, I love telling people that as a park ranger, I could never answer people's questions when they asked me, where's your favorite place to go to eat in town? Because to answer that would be an endorsement of a particular place by the federal government. So, which, gosh, I just want them to endorse this place. It's so good. Um, but you kind of have to think along the lines of who you're presenting to and who's sponsoring that speech, because that shouldn't change the integrity of the information that you're giving. But if the federal government says, like, this is what we say about a thing, then if you're working for the federal government, you kind of have to say the thing.
I
Does
think
that
that's
at
really,
all answer your question?
yeah, I was going to say that actually is helpful context because the way I think about this myself is if you're working for a school district or you're designing a game that has to do with history, right? In my own work, that includes Courtroom 600, our project to create a virtual reality experience about the history and legacies of the Holocaust and World War II. And no matter which of those roles you take on, you are an instructor, you're a storyteller, you're a designer, you're the person who ultimately is making the call as to what information is included and what information is not. And that's kind of why I was thinking this might be a helpful segue into what you were going to talk about this evening, which is essentially whose perspective do we take when talking about a complicated issue that and what does it mean that they were the ones who got to tell this story and or who gets to tell that story and why do they get to tell it? And I don't know, you're probably better positioned to talk about all of this than me. So I'm happy to hand it over to you if you'd like to start presenting
Oh,
your work.
great. It's fun to it's fun to hear what you think the details of this conversation are, considering like the the general gist of what I will be talking about, but not the specifics. Uh, so if there are uh, questions that you have that I don't explicitly address, please feel free to ask them, and that goes for anybody who's here. I'm going to start with a few free associations, and I invite you to put your answers in the chat if you'd like, or you can meditate on them to yourselves. You can feel free to come off mute, whichever feels right for you tonight. So I want to know what comes to mind when I say the 1920s. Just think about it for a second. Things in the chat. What about when I say Jim Crow? What about when I say gender affirming surgeries? And lastly, what do you think when I say colonialism and medically motivated white supremacy? Many of you likely thought of, oh my goodness. Haha, hey, look at that. Many of you likely thought of flappers and speakeasies, of F. Scott Fitzgerald and wild late night parties in the 1920s. Most folks tend to think of the Reconstruction era of intense voter suppression, like grandfather clauses that gave rise to the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870, of lynchings and sharecropping that we learn about in late 19th century units in history class. And gender affirming surgeries, well, okay, so that's a contemporary issue. I did use a modern term in asking that question, so I'll admit that it was a little bit of trickery on my part, just because I try and be as correct as I can. However, trans people in gender affirming care all characterize contemporary sociopolitical landscapes of the 2020s and more modern history, right? Colonialism is how the United States came to be, and many of you probably thought of the 13 colonies and of the racially motivated pseudoscience that justified the African slave trade. For those who maybe aren't seeing, or for accessibility issues, that was in air quotes. Wasn't actually a real justification in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It's come to my attention actually earlier today that not everybody knows that Amherst, like Lord Jeffrey Amherst, like Amherst is in Amherst, Massachusetts, Amherst is in UMass Amherst, Amherst is in Amherst College, etc. He ordered giving Indigenous people smallpox blankets in the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War. So that's a thing. Just so y'all know, and that's what this kind of cartoon is depicting, this illustration. Perhaps you picked up on the fact that there's an impending plot twist, and you're all correct if that's what you were thinking. What if I told you that all of those things that I mentioned happened contemporaneously? So that the flappers and speakeasies, the rampant Jim Crow oppression, and I'd like to put a content warning for this next slide that has just a hate group in it. So many of you thought of rampant Jim Crow oppression in the KKK, and gender affirming surgeries and medically justified colonialism all existed in the 1920s. I think everybody is sitting down for that big reveal, which is great. But why is it a big reveal? Like, why is that a big thing? History is no less complicated and convoluted than life in the 2020s. However history comes to us, it's presented by educators and popular media and family members as stories. At its core, the study and practice of history is all about ethical storytelling. So we, meaning historians, make decisions about what information we include in our papers and our exhibits, tours, classes. Some of these decisions are conscious. I might have spent days in an archive mining through records, and I have to select which research is relevant and important enough to include in the final cut. And some are out of our hands. In going to that archive, I need to recognize that collections managers and curators have decided for me what is or is not in their collection. Sometimes they make these choices because they only have enough money to conserve a handful of items and they have to choose what will survive. And sometimes, kind of like we were talking about before, like the mission statement of their organization means that they have to collect certain materials over other materials. History is most often viewed as a collection of facts that happened a long time ago. And if I had a nickel for every time that I've heard that happened decades ago, it's over, it doesn't matter, the past is the past, I'd be able to purchase an entire textbook for my next semester, which doesn't sound like a lot, but like if all I'm getting are nickels, it's a lot of, that's like a lot of nickels. That's a lot of times people say that. And I'm here to confidently assert that history is anything but objective, which means that real human beings are making real choices about which elements of which era are told to which people at what time in their lives. So to prep for today, I snagged some books off of my shelf that haven't seen the light of day since I was in grad school the last time. And I cracked open one of these books, Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. And there it is, chapter 1, The Power in the Story. Boom, that's it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, we're over. Choyo writes, oh, hey, look, haha, a slide that I forgot about. Museums aren't neutral, fun fact. Choyo writes, in vernacular use, history means both the facts of the matter and a narrative of those facts, both what happened and that which is said to have happened. In short, historians are their own kinds of storytellers, some of whom, looking at you, K-12 curriculums in the 1776 report, bill their version as the one story to rule them all. I love me a good case study. So let's look at a profoundly relevant contemporary topic. This is like a lead up to something you all already know. We're going to be talking about queer history. But there are a lot of historical falsehoods that are parading around as immutable facts when it comes to queer history. So by a show of hands, real, digital, you can put in the chat, whatever feels good to you, or you can just think to yourself. How many of you thought or were taught that trans people are a millennial and Gen Z fad? The gender nonconformity in particular is new. And there's no need to be shy. I'll disclose that I hadn't fully heard of trans people. I hadn't really heard of trans people until college. And well, look at me now. When we examine the history, and to be precise, I'll say I'm thinking about Choyo's definition of history as narrative of LGBTQIA+ people. It's crucial, as it is for all sectors of history. But that's why this is a great case study, to interrogate why people are using this misinformation. Historians are trained to sniff out bias all over the place, including their own. So I'll break down trans narratives into two contemporary camps. Camp number 1, trans people are a post-2000 creation. And 2, trans people have always been around, have been around since the dawn of time. And if I were a cheeky pedant, which, fun fact, I am, I'd go on a tangent about how time, as we understand it today, is really only a couple hundred years old. And was motivated by rapid industrialization. So really, it's a pretty weak point to begin with, but I digress. So in Camp number one, those in camp number one are peddling that trans people are a recent invention. They often wield this narrative when trying to curb access to trans people's gender-affirming care, their access to facets of daily life like restrooms, sports, which is the current trend right now, etc. Also with pronouns, I'm not sure if like this next phrase is a thing that people hear often these days, but like when I was a kid, we only had men and women, and I liked things simple like that, which is almost a verbatim quote from somebody I know. Super disappointing. Anyway, this narrative that trans people are new is used by many to justify regulating trans people's daily lives. Those in camp number two who combat camp number one's narrative by insisting that trans people have always existed, like, look at this AFAB person wearing a pantsuit in the 19th century, often call on historical actors as a bulwark against the notion that trans people are new and scary threat to modern life. So trans people have been around for all of time, then what the heck is there to be afraid of? This might come as a shock to everybody here, but I take issue with both of those narratives. First, each is motivated by a clear bias, which makes me immediately skeptical about what truth of what they're saying actually is. And second, is anything in life ever that neat and clean? Like, no, that's just nothing in life is that easy. And neither is history. So even the most cut and dry conclusions, like the American Civil War was about slavery, which is true, have supporting them a whole mess of complicated factors that might share a common ancestor. So in this micro example, slavery. But to get a robust understanding of any historical conclusion like that means complicating our narrative more than maybe we'd like. One of my favorite historians and a pioneer in the field of gay history, George Chauncey, observed that the Whiggish notion that change is always progressive and that gay history in particular consists of a steady movement towards freedom continues to have appeal. In his seminal work, Gay New York, super good book, everybody should read it. He found that gay life in New York was less tolerated, less visible to outsiders, and more rigidly segregated in the second third of the 20th century than in the first. So like we're getting more oppressive, basically. And that the severity of the post-war reaction to homosexuality, post-war meaning World War II, had tended to blind us to the relative tolerance of the pre-war years. So basically, following World War II, a revision of historical memory happened so that we don't question the reality of the current dichotomy, the current binary, the current sexual landscape of the United States that we have today. As an extension of Chauncey's findings, it turns out that even the most basic structure of our day-to-day existences, the gender binary, seems to be a post-World War II invention. This isn't to say that men and women didn't exist before the 1940s. They absolutely did. But the rigidity with which we understand the binary is pretty new. Transgressing gender and sexual norms in, say, 1920s New York wasn't uncommon. Some gay and queer men in the early 1900s described moving between different personas and different lives, one straight, the other gay, to wear their hair up, or as another common phrase put it, let their hair down. Fairies, as they were called, are likely the closest approximation to trans people that the historical record has thus far churned up. And they were a prominent fixture of turn-of-the-century New York City neighborhoods, such as the Bowery. And I'll qualify here that a lot of this visible homosexual or gay or queer culture in these cities is a very working class phenomenon and kind of discludes middle and upper classes, which is a privacy thing, like money can buy you privacy. Fun fact. So fairies are flamboyantly effeminate, and one investigator writing in 1899 described them as such. These men act effeminately. Most of them are painted and powdered. They are called Princess this and Lady so-and-so and the Duchess of Marlborough, and get up and sing as women and dance, ape the female character, call each other sisters, and take people out for immoral purposes. So it's certainly not incorrect to note the parallels between fairy identities of the 1910s and 1920s and trans identities today. However, as Chauncey cautioned, while such parallels can serve useful analytical purposes, their deployment needs to be calculated and precise. Why is that? It seems that using terminology that resonates with a contemporary audience is the best way to get that point across to the same contemporary audience, no? But in using ahistorical terminology to describe historical actors, we lose the nuance and unique characteristics of those individuals' lived experiences. Calling a fairy trans, for example, loses sight of how people interacted with fairies and how fairies interacted with their worlds. During this time before the hetero-homo binary classified people into rigid dichotomy based on who they slept with, a normal man, for example, again in air quotes, could have penetrative sex with a fairy, and so long as he assumed the dominant or masculine role of penetrating rather than being penetrated, which was seen as an effeminate sexual position, his status as normal was not called into question. 2, to call fairies trans before there existed the rigid gender binary that characterizes society today loses the colorful fluidity with which the gender expression could and sometimes did exist 100 years ago. So perhaps then a more historically accurate argument might be that gender transgression is a near historical constant. One of my favorite individuals, Mary Walker, who was a surgeon in the American Civil War, is another person that people like to call trans. She famously wore men's army uniforms rather than dresses, and she participated very successfully in the surgical field, which in the 1860s shockingly did not feature many women. They were typically nurses, caregivers, etc., volunteers. Even though Mary Walker continued to wear menswear after the Civil War, concluded until her death in 1919, so this picture was taken circa 1873, which is like 20 years after the war. I still wouldn't call her trans, if nothing else, because the structures against which we consider transness today, so the binary, the concept of passing, medical transitioning, and more, that are all wrapped up in how we fundamentally understand who and what trans people are, did not exist or were not widely prominent in the 19th century, at least not in the United States. Such terminology would be a really ill fit for somebody like Mary. So in examining queer history and the history of gender transgression, which was much more visible, as Shansi points out, amongst the working class, it is important as well to ask what survives. Why, for example, is there a whole canon on gay men, but very little on lesbians and those who transgress gender? One of the many answers is that women either did not create the volume of artifacts that survived than men, and or that historians, collectors, women's contemporaries did not preserve women's material culture to the extent that they did men's. So around the 1960s, there came a shift in how historians conceptualize the study of history. The shift is called New Social History. Basically, history moved away from valuing those at the top of politics and society, so think like the Founding Fathers, as the manufacturers of history, and they began to see the value and contributions of common people. So think random farmer whose historical record was made and did not extend beyond their farm. Furthermore, a lot of what women produced, such as textiles, didn't survive as well as many of the things that men produced, metalware like publications, merchant records, etc. This means that our access to a more robust and accurate understanding of the past is fundamentally at a disadvantage. Add on to that, all of this, that women did not occupy the public sphere as they do today until about the post-World War II era, and we're left to understand that as ethical historians and stewards of the past, we need to creatively seek answers to our questions rather than assume that an absence in the historical record means an absence in history. So little is written about lesbian and queer women's history, particularly prior to World War II, and a lot of this has to do with what survived and what historians of yore considered valuable material culture. In short, people didn't really know where to find women's and queer women's history. One place to look is in the home. Boston marriages, for example, comprised of unwed middle-class women who lived together, owned property together, slept in the same bed, and enjoyed robust family lives together, were rather visible to the outside world and accepted by society. So concluded a couple of really bigwig historians, John D'Amelio and Estelle Freeman. You might have heard of their book, Intimate Matters, A History of Sexuality. Additionally, the introduction of women's colleges in the mid to late 19th century did a lot to facilitate what we call homosocial spaces. What one person who taught at Mount Holyoke in the 19th century described as hotbeds of special sentimental friendships. Yet the misunderstanding in the Victorian era of women as non-sexual beings created a narrative that encouraged people to gloss over and ignore sexual deviance between women. If they're asexual creatures anyway, or they don't really enjoy sex, then two women living together, sleeping in the same bed together, etc., growing old together, they're just friends. With the New Deal in World War II, men and women had opportunities to engage in homosocial spaces like they hadn't before. And the post-World War II era brought with it a cultural backlash to the visibility of sexual deviance in the first half of the 20th century. Again, this isn't to say that sexual and gender deviance did not exist before World War II. It definitely did. However, our contemporary understanding of queer and gay people in society was molded by reactionary policies and politics of the post-World War II and Cold War eras. As historian Margot Kennedy points out, federal bureaucrats had been aware of traits and behaviors that were coming to be associated with homosexuality for at least half a century, but the pre-war regulatory response to this knowledge was, quote, fairly anemic. Not only did society react to the gay world of the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s with the imposition of a more rigid gender and sexual binary, federal legislation and federal action during the Cold War incentivized homosexuals to closet themselves. The GI Bill was an incredibly wide-reaching welfare benefit in the post-World War II era that simultaneously made accessible things like homeownership and education to working and middle-class families, while excluding from those benefits soldiers discharged for homosexuality. Additionally, the GI Bill filtered many of its benefits through marriage, in that male heads of households were eligible for veterans assistance. Male heads of households meaning married men, men married women. So if you were homosexual or gay, that was an incentive to not do that or not publicly do that at any rate. This is a hallmark moment in the creation of the closet in the United States. It meant that for the first time ever, there was a positive reason to hide one's homosexuality from the world in an effort to access financial assistance. Coming out in the pre-war years was more akin to a debutante entering society. It was a coming out into what was often called homosexual society or the gay world, a world, explained Chauncey, that was neither so small nor so isolated nor often so hidden as closet implies. Here we can see a very clear example of where ahistorically discussing history clouds the reality of our narratives, or clouds the reality of the past, and where we as ethical storytellers have an obligation to choose our words and the elements of our narratives carefully and with precision. If the closet, as we understand it today, did not exist until federal programs like the GI Bill carved out space for its existence, then calling queer people closeted in the first third of the 20th century is an absolute misnomer. So for those of you who are keeping track, this means that both camp number 1, that says that trans identities are a recent creation, and camp number 2, that says that trans people have always and forever existed, both have nuggets of truth and are quite imprecise. To employ an overused academic phrase, there's a lot to unpack. To be sure, and as Margot Kennedy notes, a straight, gay, and male-female binary existed in federal bureaucracy before it trickled down into society as a whole. Many factors contributed to the widespread emergence of the binary. What the heck is even next in this thing? Not yet. Many factors contributed to the widespread emergence of the binary, and many of the LGBTQIA+ identities as we understand them today. Among them is a transnationalism of endocrinology and gender science that called into question while simultaneously codifying the existence of males and females. Another contemplation for you all. How many of you heard, and pretend I didn't just accidentally give away the next slide, but how many of you have heard of Christine Jorgensen? It's okay if you haven't. I hadn't until I studied. Cool, great. See a head shake. Christine Jorgensen was the first person to enter the national spotlight as a transsexual woman here in the United States. She served under her birth name and assigned gender in World War II and went to Denmark in 1950 to undergo gender-affirming surgery. As Cold War anxieties, atomic stress, and communist threats heightened in the United States, Christine Jorgensen emerged on the national stage in 1952 when she returned to the US a blonde beauty, and you can see like the big story. Her story and experiences brought with them a new relationship to the immutability of sex in post-war America. In conjunction with the codification of the male-female binary in the 1940s that Chauncey chronicled, Jorgensen's trans identity underscored that there was some fundamental sex to transition from and to. Cutting edge, pun intended, medical science that took place overseas opened the possibility for transness to exist as we know it today. While Jorgensen noted that she always felt effeminate, socially isolated, and different from male peers, it wasn't until she read a book on endocrinology in the 1940s that she identified herself as a woman. Perhaps this is the case because the possibility of medical transition simply did not exist in the American conscious prior to the second third of the 20th century. How could Jorgensen, how can anyone really, identify as something that they don't know about? But with the advancements of gender science in Europe, Denmark and Germany were pioneering countries when it came to gender and sexual science, came an expansion of possibility, an identity expansion pack. Jorgensen's story and the story of gender anxieties in Cold War America wouldn't be complete without mentioning McCarthyism. It's not complete anyway. This is like, 20 minutes and it's just not complete. But it wouldn't be more complete, sort of, without mentioning McCarthyism and the emergence of the hypermasculinity versus ultra-femininity, at least in middle and upper classes. While Jorgensen was destabilizing the very concept of sex and gender, which were really only beginning to be understood when it was immediately called into question by the emergence of transsexual identities, cornerstones of American identity were engaged in like a Fezzik-style battle of the wits with communist USSR. Many of you are likely familiar with the strategic emergence of the suburb and ideal family life. So like the suburban marriage and 2.5 kids and white picket fence and etc. It's like reminds me very Tim Burton-y type of thing. So this is a reactionary ideology to the Soviet Union. Folks have likely at least heard of the Red Scare that sought to purge from federal employment those holding communist sympathies. Alongside the Red Scare was what came to be known as the Lavender Scare, which is the federal purge of gay and lesbian workers. Slowly and all at once, the United States created for itself this system of values that we still see today. One of the most poignant and persnickety lies that this value system taught and continues to teach is that the reality in which we currently live is how things always have been. Like, what an incredible way to wage a war of ideals against the communist threat to democracy. No, fabricate an identity that didn't exist prior to World War II, and then insist that such a way of life is baked into fundamental human existence, as is the need to breathe and eat. And this is where we come full circle, at least for now. The United States created one version of its history to serve its own goals in the Cold War, and that narrative largely continues today, though there are definitely signs of cracking and weakening. So like all of this research that made this experience tonight possible. The work of ethical historians seeks to uncover multiple truths about the past every day. Even still, those with the best of intentions use history to affect certain ends. And it's important to note that like Chauncey's Gay New York, which I obviously hold in high esteem given the number of times I brought it up tonight, was published on the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. And for those who might not be familiar, the Stonewall Riots are famous end of June, beginning of July, 1969 riots led by trans women of color that they were just like really fed up with police raids on gay bars. And it turned in this whole thing. Stonewall Riot remembrance parades were the precursor to gay pride parades today. So anyway, so this was published on the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. And though I trust Chauncey's historical methodology enough to believe most of what he says, I'm very skeptical of what he leaves out of his book. Gay New York paints a very idealized picture of the gay world in the first third of the 20th century. Identifying such biases doesn't make the scholarship less sound, but it does mean that there are probably 100 different pieces of the puzzle that Chauncey chose not to engage for one reason or another. Historical memory is a powerful tool in rewriting the past. Such memory gave us the myth of the lost cause following the American Civil War, which I mentioned this before. I'm like only too happy to talk about the Civil War at length at almost any given point in any given day. The romantic notion of the glory of World War I, and the myth of American exceptionalism from World War I and beyond. In the face of this constant barrage of rewritten history, faded memory, and made-up facts, how do we learn the truth? Well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. It's complicated, and it's a never-ending answer, I think. One of the most effective ways we can be ethical storytellers is by being aware of our own and others' biases, recognizing that neutrality doesn't exist, and even the primary materials that we turn to craft our unbiased stories are curated selections themselves. If we approach history in this manner, then maybe when someone finds an incredible treasure trove of new information that completely upends my and others' understanding of queer history, we'll be ready and welcome it with appreciation and open arms. An ethical historian and ethical storyteller will adapt and reinterpret the past, craft a new narrative that takes into account this new and exciting information because it gets us fully one step closer to understanding what drives us a lot to interrogate the past in the first place. This desire to understand what life was like in the before. And that's what I got for you. That's scripted. Let's take this off script. What do you want to know?
First, a little round of applause. I'll do my little circular round of applause here.
Yes,
I like your flags and image choices here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So if other folks want to jump in with questions, again, you can feel free to raise a hand, jump in through chat, the text chat, or to speak into the microphone. I have a couple of questions, and I guess I'll start with this one since it seems the closest related to the last thing you were talking about. It's something I've been thinking about a lot since I listened to a podcast the other day uh, regarding a study on how tax law is another form of institutional racism, or it at least is expressed in a way that is institutionally racist. So the question was, how much of the definition of gender and sexuality was intentionally designed to fit that mold in the post World War II McCarthyist era, and how much of that was inadvertent or incidental? So, for instance, redlining was a thing that was done intentionally in order to harm specific populations. But the fact that the IRS didn't collect information on specific kinds of people meant it couldn't intentionally do things that were harmful to specific constituencies. But because of the way that we think about family units being constructed, tax law would harm people who were working class, and because the proportionate number of people who were working class were Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples, that would affect the way that we think about who gets tax rebates or refunds and who doesn't, and how is the family constructed. So, as you put it, there was sort of this positive social, economic, cultural incentive to uh, become a certain kind of family unit. And so I'm kind of curious about how you think about the intentionality of something like that versus how much of it is just an artifact of different systems just bouncing off of each other.
It's a little bit of both. Um, there were a lot of words and concepts coming out of that gender science and endocrinology that was happening overseas in Germany and Denmark, um, that served as the foundation for some of these identities and concepts and things like that. But the way they were used in the US, I think, was an intentional choice. And you see this in a lot of works by a whole bunch of people, some of whom I mentioned tonight, that there was a really strong and intentional backlash following the end of prohibition. Like, that's not even, I didn't even freaking talk about prohibition, but prohibition was like also allowed that visible gay space to exist. Why? Because again, with that class-based privacy, um, that means that middle and upper class people who could afford their own homes, that could afford to live in isolated spaces, in insular communities, that kind of thing, they left the public sphere because alcohol was illegal, so they were going to do it in their house instead of do it in public. And that made space for working class and those without the financial ability to, like immigrants as well, like this was really big in immigrant communities, um, to occupy those spaces. And at the end of Prohibition in 1933, middle and upper class people were like, hey, wait a second, that's my spot. Like, that's my bar. Get out. And so then you see a lot of like this really intentional backlash, not necessarily to the identities, but to like just, I mean, the identity and the space got so intertwined that it's like that just by trying to kick gay people out of these spaces and reclaim these public social spaces, they like de facto discriminated against like a whole bunch of people. And then I mean, just the stinking Cold War really screwed it up for a lot of us, in the way that the United States had like a reason, like a global reason to enact some of these things that Margot Canaday was talking about, that kind of existed in the federal conscience. So like a lot of the things that she mentioned in her book, she had this whole section on immigration, and you could see in the early part of the 1900s, uh, some of the remarks that people made, some of the decisions that people at Ellis Island were making on who got admitted to the United States and who didn't get admitted to the United States was based off of this gender science that was coming out of Europe. So, like, the following World War II and the communist threat to democracy gave the United States a reason to operationalize that on a wider scale, which then impacted society.
So one of the things I keep going back to is whether or not the what the phenomenon you're describing is something that is unique to those periods in history in which they were happening, or if it's something that can be or will be replicated in the future, or if these things are just sort of tied into the human condition. Like, so this is my next question that I had written down was, how do you think about the cyclical nature
Yeah.
of history, and does the past, like the quote, the past doesn't repeat itself but it does rhyme, like how do you think about some of these things as a historian?
I was just going to ask if this was your time as a circle question. I think it is. Uh, yeah. So, right. Um, I think there are a lot of consistencies and a lot of patterns that you see in history. Um, a lot of people reimagining and forgetting the lessons of the past, whatever. Like I think, for example, we can talk about like World War I was the war to end all wars. Well, plot twist, that didn't happen. Um, and people were just like so certain that war, like this was just so awful. Certainly nobody would ever do this again. Well, clearly that didn't work out very well. Um, and you see that kind of like revision happening over and over again. I don't like I have my own opinions and theories about this, and as somebody who's trying to practice ethical history, I can't say that is historically supported argument. That's just how I feel about people in general. Um, and I think making some conclusions like that is an example of using history in a dangerous way. Like to use the past and to use history to say a fundamental truth about time, which is already constructed, um, is seems like maybe not what history is kind of about. Does that fumbling make any sense?
I mean, I think it makes sense.
Thank you.
One of yeah, you're very welcome. One of the things I've thought a lot about is how technology sort of exacerbates these problems. Like when you describe the early 20th century, I'm looking at the current relatively early 21st century, and how many of these things are demonstrative of human impulses or the kinds of stories that humans have told themselves for centuries. It's just that technology has made it possible to tell those stories to more people more easily. And that's sort of influencing the way that we behave around one another. So, one of the things that I end up talking about in all the classes that I teach is that when you tell a story, it actually matters a lot in how you think about what you're trying to say and why you're saying it, and that you can't sort of do that flippantly, because if you do it flippantly, it leaves open to interpretation a lot of things that you potentially don't want to be endorsing, or like for historical reasons, it makes sense to not endorse. So, when you say ethical historical storytelling, or we have to be ethical in the context of doing this task of explaining history to people. How do you think about that role, that being ethical? What does it mean to
Yeah,
be ethical as a historian?
yeah. So another one of my favorite things that people like to say about history is that it's which is great for somebody who's like majored in history and has a grad degree in history and has practiced history in the field and things like that. It's really neat to hear that like just anybody can do history, which I get really prickly about because specifically because historical training isn't necessarily about learning the facts of what happened. Like, you might equate with like your APUS history class in high school or whatever, where you're supposed to be learning like Stamp Act was passed in this, I don't even remember when it was passed, sometime in the 1760s. But the historical training is about the methodology of history, is about how you ethically do this, how you make sure that you are weeding out as much bias as you can, that you're making conclusions based on the actual materials that you see and interpret those accordingly, as opposed to, talking about like the Second Amendment and founding fathers' intent because it serves your current NRA purposes, right? Like there is a difference in the support for conclusions that you might make that are supported by primary source materials, by secondary source materials that have been rigorously tested, or that for whom historians have gone through similar kinds of rigorous methodology. And I think that's partly why public history is really important to make accessible some of these things, and also to help set the record straight about like aliens, you know, all of this like history channels. Oh man, woof.
I
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned the History Channel aliens, like ancient alien stuff, because one of the things that I wanted to jump to was about basically the living in the age of information or disinformation, and that when I think about history or historical storytelling, the reason why this is necessary is because it has to serve as an a balance against the forces of disinformation or the forces of essentially fascism, right? Like that you have to maintain a historical record that reflects as close as possible to some version of, I guess capital T truth is not the right way to think about it, but rather some version of accounting for what happened in the past, that undercuts or prevents the kinds of attitudes about rejecting reality that make it possible for fascism to take hold in a particular place or time. And I mean, I say fascism, but really what I'm talking about is sort of these malactors or forces within, you know, institutions, cultures, political bodies, economic structures, all of these things that sort of act against the interests of most people.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I really appreciate about my own historical training is honing the ability to think critically. Like that is just so important, right? Like, yes, anybody can go to an archive and look at papers and draw conclusions about the things. And it's important that those who are making conclusions about stuff that happened in the past have taken into account the biases of the records that they're looking at, what survives, what doesn't survive, their own biases and motivations for doing this, right? Like it's and it's really hard, it's super hard for me to do. But making sure that you're asking questions and you're not going into research trying to confirm a conclusion, right? Like I'm going in to answer questions. I'm not going in for confirmation bias. And I think that the ability to do that is something that history tries to teach people, like that that study of history tries to teach people. Just super hard lesson. I really want to be right a lot, and you know this. Um, and so it's really hard for me to like let that go and just ask a question and see what happens. Because I'm like really committed to having a particular conclusion, and that's my own thing that I have to be aware of when I do research projects and stuff like that.
It's so I really like the way you put that. It's because of the fact that it perfectly positions the difference between what I think scientists do, and I would put historians in this category as well. Like I think doing the science of history versus people who do strictly law, like because the lawyer is going into a
Do
courtroom.
say.
Yes, I really want to talk to you about this because I think you have a very interesting opinion about it, but a lawyer goes into a courtroom and has to make an argument based on what they think is going to best help their client or help the whatever it is that they are doing, whether it's prosecuting or defending. And they are not necessarily going and looking for all the evidence to weed out what's true and not true and get to some sense of what actually happened. Like they have a specific incentive structure in place to help them do a job, and their job is partly to construct a narrative to convince a jury or convince a judge or convince these other parties, the media, for instance, how to feel about a particular thing. And that's a very emotionally loaded thing that's very different than the science of history. And so as somebody who does both, who's like kind of do has gone to graduate school for history and is also doing law, like I know that I actually was thinking about bringing this up as well. We've talked about harm reduction in the way that Chase Strangio, who if you aren't familiar, Chase is a lawyer with the ACLU who's argued before the Supreme Court, including in the most recent case regarding transgender rights. Basically, Chase talks about harm reduction, and is that kind of how you view law? I realize it's a leading question. I
That
told
is
you
a
I would
very
try to
leading
avoid
question.
that. But so, okay, let me rephrase that. How do you think about the difference between sort of the science of history and the way that it's sort of applied in a legal context, or do you think there are multiple domains in which these different interlocking pieces sort of operate?
Okay, I'm gonna pare back what I think I heard so that I address your actual question. So you were wondering kind of what I think about the difference, what I think about the difference between a scientific methodology, maybe like going in to get an answer to a question, versus the overt manipulation of facts to serve a particular end. Like those are fundamentally different things.
Sort of. So
So
I
what do
guess
you?
so. What I'm kind of thinking about is you had been talking about the avoiding wanting to go into the act of history to find a particular conclusion, right? That you
Yes,
don't want to go in and know what you're looking for and then find evidence that supports that conclusion
it's quite frowned
specifically.
upon.
Yeah, I mean, you
Yes.
don't want to do things that like bias everything you're trying to argue, right?
Yeah,
So,
you really don't.
how do you think about the fact that we socially, culturally have sort of pitted those two perspectives against one another, but pretend they're kind of the same thing, so
Oh,
that
that makes
you
me
know
so mad.
well, I guess that's kind of why I wanted to bring it up, is because I think that television, for instance, has done a disservice to illustrating how justice is actually served in a society, because it positions us to think about the structures or institutions of something like justice being centered on things that they are not actually centered on. And I feel like that's also part of the historical slash legal narrative that we've constructed for ourselves.
So this might not be an actual answer to your question, but I think it's highly relevant and really interesting. The what is at your disposal and what is useful in the law and in history are different. So historians can look wherever the hell they want to look. They can look in legal records. They can look at court opinions. They can look at papers that whoever, random person created. Like diaries are really fun to read, just in case anybody's wondering. Like if you go into an archive, you're like, there's a diary, read it. It's real cool. Um, and so historians can look at any breadth of things, including like the ground, like the land. Like if you go to a battlefield, right? So I went to school at Gettysburg College, and Gettysburg is a battlefield. And if you go walking and you look like on a piece of paper in a textbook, and you're like Pickett's charge is just like two lines of people, like just like that's stupid. But if you go to the actual field, it's not maybe as stupid as it looks in a book, because of the topography, and you see like anyway. So historians can use all of this cool stuff. It's not to say that legal people can't use cool stuff. It's just that the things that you use when you argue court cases are other court cases. Why? Because you want the court to follow or deviate from or whatever particular legal conclusions. Courts are bound by particular decisions within their chain of command, basically. So, like state courts are beholden to what the appeals court of the state. So trial courts have to like listen to what appeals courts have ruled on, and appeals courts have to listen to what the Supreme Court of the state has ruled on, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you conduct legal research, it is fundamentally different, because you're looking at past decisions and basically doing a like compare and contrast of facts in the case that you're trying to argue and the cases that were argued in the past, and coming to a conclusion about the application of a particular logic or a particular conclusion or something like that. Plot twist, it's not. A lot of old court cases, and court cases now, like the justice system is broken, right? Like it's fundamentally not, it does not serve justice, or does not serve justice for everybody. And so the previous court cases that courts are beholden by, it's called stare decisis. It's like the thing that it's the doctrine that you have to listen to your previous rulings, whatever, means that for forever and all, like for a really long time, unless somebody goes against stare decisis, courts are going to rule based off of maybe flawed logic and shitty facts. And like that just is, whereas like a historian can point that out. Like it's just fundamentally different and kind of crazy pants and pretty annoying.
I guess so to circle back to I had brought up harm reduction and what Chase Strangio said about it. The reason why I brought that up was because I think there are these strange incentive crossroads for the different roles that people have when they're doing different kinds of, I think, historical or historically related research. And so when we're talking about ethical historical storytelling, I wonder about like how do you square the circle on how those different institutions, whether it's the court system and the legal system versus the academic structures of history, and that includes things like museums and libraries and other places that have exhibits. Like, how do you think about their role for harm reduction or ethical storytelling as institutions, and their responsibility to think about the way they construct arguments? So, for instance, if you're a museum curator and you have to decide what elements belong in an exhibit and which ones do you exclude, do you have this monument or that monument? Do you include a diary entry from this person or that person, versus the kinds of storytelling, ethical storytelling that have to be done in the context of law, where you have to decide, do I argue something based on flawed logic because I have to achieve a particular end, or am I doing the other thing where I'm trying to right an injustice because the logic was flawed and it needs to be fixed? So basically, how do you think about the role of harm reduction in the different fields that you operate in, history and law?
Okay. Thank you. I'm distracted because you made me think of a thing and then I got distracted looking for it. So I kind of stopped following your question. I think that that harm reduction is not a widely held concept in like the legal world. People don't really consider that. There's like one court in fun fact. There's one. I should let other people tell me they're fun. There's one court in Massachusetts, at least in Western Massachusetts, that follows a harm reductionist, like explicitly follows a harm reductionist standpoint, and it's the Family and Probate Court of Hampshire County. So it's like Northampton. This adds up, right? It's Northampton, and even so typically you can't file like custody or divorce or whatever in a county that you don't live in. But because this is the only court that does restorative justice as their fundamental practice, anybody in Western Massachusetts, or maybe anybody in Massachusetts, can apply to this particular court. So like I know somebody who was getting divorced and had a custody thing. They live in Franklin County, which is like Greenfield and stuff, and they applied in Hampshire County because of that thing. So I would say that harm reduction is not really a top priority of most people work as lawyers or in the courts, which is really, really disappointing and sad. As for places like museums, I think that concept is taking off more than it is in the legal world, just based off of the people that I know and the work that they're doing. The curator that I worked for when I worked at the National Museum of American History was just an incredible person who, this is a bias, an incredible person who really tried to curate and collect and make exhibits that addressed history, that like addressed some maybe uncomfortable fundamental truths about history or fundamental things about history, like addressing racism, addressing classism, addressing ableism, and things like that. She was a curator in the Department of Medicine and Science, so she had a lot of stuff about like she had a curb cut from some ADA around the time that the ADA was passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and collected, like she collects a lot of things that people wouldn't, like who wants a hunk of concrete, but that tell a really important story that isn't often found in the historical record. So I think that museums are maybe doing a little bit of a better job of addressing harm reduction and restorative justice than the legal system, but I reserve the right to change my mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a question for you, just kind of your opinion on this. So, in the past, a lot of the information that was widely disseminated and therefore was easy to preserve was it was curated for the public by whoever was in power. So the history that's widely taught, the narratives that preserve for the general public who don't have the resources or the time to go looking for history, it's what was accepted at the time. But now we're in an information age, it's true, but we're in a lot of really self-filtered bubbles where a narrative can go viral if a person is gay or trans in the right way, where if they're white and they're attractive and they're monogamous, or what's widely accepted still by the general public. But if someone's too other or too intersectional, it's still ignored. And there's obviously there's people who will seek out those narratives and now they have the ability to do so, but we're still in such a filtered system where now instead of being narrated by a few people in power, it's being narrated by the general public. So what kind of impact do you think that's going to have on history as we're building it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. I hope a positive one. I think that we're really going to see a big need for teaching and understanding the methodology of history, in an effort to like weed out disinformation, for example, like that's really circulated and things like that, and to make sure that the integrity of the questioning is there. Um, I I do think that there's a larger like visibility of some people who wouldn't otherwise make it into the historical record. So I conducted some oral histories when I was in grad school for a national touring exhibit on mass incarceration in the United States, and had the opportunity to speak with queer organizers out of Springfield. And these are folks who like told their whole families, like celebrated when we told them that the recording got into the archive. They're like, oh my gosh, somebody cares enough about what I have to say to preserve that. That's neat. Because like it just would never happen. So there are a lot of really like technology has given us the opportunity to preserve um, a wide range of people's stories. So like the Twitterscape verse, whatever. Like there's so many things, so many ways of production that people are now able to participate in preservable mediums that didn't exist before, and I think that's very exciting. And I think that that also means that there's a lot of work to be done for like analysts and folks, making sure that they're uh, with the wider range of availability of things, that they are seeking out those platforms. So one of the things that was really that changed kind of the methodology of queer history when Chauncey published his book, it truly was like it changed how people thought about this and how people approached queer history. It was published in 1994, and one of the things that he mentions is that up until that point, like people, they looked in like the New York Times, they looked at whatever mainstream media, um, and didn't find anything, right? Because those were the mediums that circulated in the upper and middle classes, and like that wasn't where the visible gay culture was. And like you're an upper class person, you're not really going to be like writing articles about how gay you are. And so he started to look at some of the newspapers that were circulating in communities of color and immigrant communities. And that's where he found all his information. And so there was this understanding of like, oh, just because something isn't where I think it is, doesn't mean it's not there. And I need to do a better job of finding it because it probably exists somewhere. I just haven't found out where yet. And so I think there's a lot more space for us to find these stories, and find these narratives and find these experiences, because there is a lot more participation and a lot more people of different backgrounds and different abilities and different diversities are creating more content for us, which is really exciting. Yeah, is that maybe answered your question? You can feel free to ask a related or a different one if I didn't get the point.
I think one of the biggest challenges that I've been thinking about in the context of Courtroom 600 and at least the contact that I have with history or historical artifacts is what do you do with all of this stuff? Like, how do you even curate it? There's so much information. How do you make sense of it? And
How do you
what this
curate
kind
it?
of gets at something we've talked about, you and I have talked about before, which is what does it even mean in the context of all of these structures that are artificial and, you know, man-made anyway, or human created, right? Like that all of that gender is a construct, that
It
race is a
is.
construct, that
It
all of
is.
these things are constructs. How do
Yeah.
we even begin to organize information in a way that kind of makes sense or you know, I guess maybe that gets at a bigger question of like, what is the goal? Like, what are we ultimately trying to do with all this information? Do you think?
Hmm. Well, I say it depends on who's talking. There are some people who conduct their research from a like purely question-based perspective, and then there are folks like I mentioned, like again, Chauncey. Gosh, I love him so much. But he like I think his methodology is really sound. He's like a Columbia professor, like used to teach at Yale, like super whatever, you know, supposedly the creme de la creme of for historians. And even stuff like his book that I love so much, and won't shut up about, uh, was like was published for a particular anniversary, like that had a bent, it had a space, um, it had a motivation behind it, and so I think it depends on who you're talking to, and who you're talking about, and who is saying that history. The 1776 report, maybe this only stands out in my mind because I hate it so much. It's like awful history, um, but that had such an obvious agenda, like that. Don't trust a dang thing in there. Personally, a lot of other historians don't either. They're like, this is not good. This is bad, actually, quite not good. There's something that one of your questions made me think about, and I want to say it, that I think goes to the point of narrative, and what we learn about. So we learn that Brown versus Board of Education overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. So overruled the court case that made the separate but equal doctrine thing, and presumably Brown v. Board overruled that. Well, haha, if you actually read the case, it like doesn't explicitly overrule Plessy. There's no language that says we were wrong. There's no language that says separate is not equal. That was a very specific case that ruled on children's education, that separate educational facilities cannot be equal. And then the work of lawyers beyond that court case, that SCOTUS decision that came down in 1954, 55, the 50s, they worked to apply that logic. And here's where the concept of stare decisis and how legal researchers and how legal activists do their work, they had to then spend years adapting that ruling from education to like the rest of society. And there's still segregated schools. Like that still happens. That's still a thing. And we're taught this narrative that like, oh, Brown v. Board like overruled this thing, and now huzzah, no more segregation. But like no, yeah, no, and yes at the same time. And there are a lot of other decisions that are like this. Like this is not a unique thing here. Also, one of the just cases that blows my tiny mind. There was one court case that upheld, and you don't learn about this either, that like you're like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. It was great, hunky dory, huzzah. Now we all have civil rights, etc. It was challenged in court, of course, obviously, and upheld under the Commerce Clause, not because rights are fundamental and we should have those, but because segregation affected commerce. Like, what the heck? I wasn't taught that. why, like, and so you have to go to the, because if you don't fully understand the robust history, right, like if you don't understand that Brown v. Board maybe kind of sort of but didn't overrule Plessy, that leaves so much space for those inherent inequities to continue on in different ways. Like if we're taught that this thing overruled this thing, then we stop paying attention to it. We're like, oh, great, done, segregation over, fantastic. But like, is it functionally? And understanding what actually happened helps us pay attention to other things that we might not have paid attention to.
I think that's a really good point, because a lot of people don't realize that just because a court ruled a certain way doesn't mean you can enforce it.
Yeah.
That it's always for that specific case, and you can try and use the logic, but you would need to find similar facts and work on expanding it. But also, to the same point about the Commerce Clause being the deciding factor, is always interesting and a little humorous to me that a lot of our rights are not necessarily due to the fact that we should have inherent human rights, but it's due to money. I mean, even gay marriage was not about the right to marry, it was about taxes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And going to the historical record, or maybe not even just going to the historical record, but being aware of that. Like, and again, this goes to the concept of critical thinking and what the study of history teaches you about critical thinking. Like, if you are taught to maybe not take everything at face value, then you can ask these questions, and have these challenges. Like the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause is functionally not very useful, because the Supreme Court decided that actually the Equal Protection Clause and the 14th Amendment really only applied to like former slaves. Like that's what it applied to. And so now we have to find creative ways. So there was a court later, a court case later at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court didn't want to go against their previous decision because they're bound by stare decisis, whatever. And they were like, okay, so how can we circumvent this to actually apply the Equal Protection Clause to the to, like where we want this to go? And they used the due process, like judicial due process, as their workaround, because they refused to say like, oh shoot, we messed up, like whoops. No, instead we're gonna find like creative. It's just all weird. It's odd.
So that's actually one of the reasons why I wanted to, or why I was trying to before, tie together the relationship between sort of the study or science of history versus the way that legal circles interpret that history, and why it actually kind of seems to matter a whole lot that the incentive structures are different for those things, and that basically I think that it's important to think about the way that an institution like the Supreme Court explains its reasoning about a thing, and that often it is portrayed as you've described it, as like this put it on a pedestal, this is an important, we are establishing, putting this flag in the ground, this is the way the world works. But in reality, most of the time when they're doing that, it is through a convoluted logic process bound up in all of these other things that are sort of tradition slash institutional norms slash actual law. And even then, the law itself is all stuff we socially constructed, and there's a reason why we don't listen to all the parts of the Constitution anymore. Like I get really sort of wrapped around the axle about the relationship between those things, and that if I were, a Supreme Court justice, I would be trying to figure out how do I balance an honest description of the past and its relevance to modern society in the future with what does stare decisis actually say, and why do I have to find these loopholes in order for the institution to maintain any sort of trust or fidelity, right, to anything. Like you have to have something to anchor yourself with. So
yeah, it's really it it is it's all constructed. Like it's all constructed. And the most discouraging thing is reading Supreme Court opinions where they're like, I won't overrule myself because it's embarrassing. Like that's it's almost verbatim like what they say. Like it would be truly an embarrassment to say that we were wrong like 20 years ago. So I'm not going to. And instead, I'm going to do something completely ridiculous instead, because I don't want to be embarrassed that maybe we don't know everything, and that's just special.
It seems like you're inherently always going to be, so this is one place where it seems like the science of history is always sort of going to be ahead of the application of that history or understanding of reality, where if you are somebody who's willing to say, I have a hypothesis about how something worked or works, and I can collect evidence and support that hypothesis or not support that hypothesis, you can falsify things, like all of that is possible in a context where you can say that I was wrong. But if you're put into this other context with these other incentive structures, the narrative you have to tell about that same thing is necessarily very different. And that doesn't change, or maybe it's even more apparent how true that is the higher up you go within the institution of something like law, where the Supreme Court has to contort itself into pretzels in order to maintain its function, right? In order to maintain legitimacy in some way. Whereas a historian can say that they were wrong because the costs are lower in that context.
I mean, yes, and I think the cost might be lower. First, a couple. Oh, heck. Germ theory.
If I could speak up on that, I'm not even sure you could necessarily talk about it as a cost issue. Oh, and the judiciary system is inherently based on history. It's not meant to create new law. That's not what they even have the power to do. Judiciary has the power to interpret the law as it exists. So whether they agree with it or not, they can't just say, well, no, I don't agree with it, and therefore I'm going to undo it. They need to come up with these ways because that's the way we set the system up. And even if we wanted to change that, that's a legislature issue. And then, of course, you have the same issue where then you have to challenge whether the legislature had the power to do so. How do we interpret what gives the legislature power? So it's all so wrapped up in the history of it that the judiciary is just really not the system to make the change usually. They have to get that mental gymnastics.
Definitely mental gymnastics, like for sure. And to an extent, the legislature can create law. Like, so common law is a thing. Common laws are a thing that exists, that legislatures create. So in the absence of statutory guidance, so in the absence of a law that a legislature passed, if somebody brings a court case or a question or a case to bar, and there is not a statute that guides the thing, and there is not precedent, so they're like reviewing it de novo. Meaning, like, this court has never looked at this before. And I'll also note that it's like a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. So like if California has heard that case and has these facts and et cetera, and has decided for themselves what that common law is going to be, but Massachusetts hasn't, then Massachusetts is still like they don't have to follow what California did. They can create their own thing. And so they create common law. And then if a legislature is like, I hate that, then they can legislate over it. And the legislature, like the statute, wins in our little battle of law over a common law. But courts can create common law. They don't tend to be like fundamental rights and like civil rights type legislation. Like that is governed by the Constitution and other things, and the way that the court interprets the Constitution, and there are fundamental rights that the court, yes, has looked at the Constitution and been like, what are the Bill of Rights, what are the amendments, what are like, etc. And which rights are we protecting? And those fundamental rights aren't enumerated in, like, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you have the right to procreate. But the Supreme Court has decided that procreation is a fundamental right that is protected by the Constitution. And so there are ways that you can like do that mental gymnastics enough that it seems like maybe I'm creating a new thing or a new way of applying that thing. And then if somebody hates it, they just legislate over it. Good times.
Well, it makes me think of we were talking the other day, I think, about Obergefell and the fact that when gay marriage was, for all intents and purposes, made legal, right, that it was possible to say that that was just a thing now, that the reasoning for that has nothing to do with any of the things that you were talking about earlier about queer history. Like, it has nothing to do with the GI Bill. It has nothing to do, like, all of the rationalization that went into the decision that was made was about, I believe Justice Kennedy wrote about it in the context of sort of the sadness of being alone, and that everyone has a right to be married because of, you know, they're going to be sad if they're not. And so the reason I bring that up is because it seems like bound up in all of this storytelling that's being done by the court or being done by people who have contact with these different facts or sets of facts, that the as you were saying when you opened up the whole presentation, it's all bound up in who is the audience, who am I as the speaker, what legacy do I want to leave, and how am I going to contort myself to fit all of those things together in the way that is, most accommodating of the time and resources available to me. So, like, the reason why I actually wanted to have this whole conversation about history and storytelling to begin with was because I think it's really important for people to understand that the work that justices on the Supreme Court do is not fundamentally different than the work that other kinds of storytellers, designers, uh, instructors, trainers do. It's just that the audience is different and the incentive structures are different, but they are presenting information to fulfill those particular goals. I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a little oversimplified in that they're also bound by different ties. They can't go to an archive. Like, first off, the Supreme Court only looks at review except for a few cases in which they have original jurisdiction. So most of what they're reviewing is on appeal. And review on appeal means that you don't get to add new stuff. So whatever the lower courts had already looked at, that's what the Supreme Court's going to look at. So like they can't supplement with other things. They have to look at only what they're given to make their decision. And not only what they're given, but only what they're given and like the court records and old court cases and precedent and things like that. For which, unless it's a Supreme Court case, they are not bound by any other thing. They don't have to follow anybody else. They only like have to follow their previous decisions, and even then they can overturn themselves if they want, which they hardly ever do. But well, I guess sometimes they adopt the state laws if they're looking in the states, because they can review state laws sometimes under certain situations. In which case they'll adopt the states, they like review it under the state's laws and that kind of thing. So they're bound by different stuff. Like they have different constrictions. So where I, as a federal employee, when I was working at Harpers Ferry National Historical, had to do my work within a certain guidance from the federal government, the Supreme Court has to do their work within a certain guidance from what is available to them legally and what have you. So it's like, it's not just audience, and it's also like what they have access to and what they're allowed to have access to.
I think that the reason why I wanted to talk about that was because it circles back to the ethical historical storytelling piece, where is it possible to be ethical in that context? Although I guess it depends on how you're defining who's the historical storyteller. So like in my example, I'm using Obergefell because I think that the people, if you were the one writing the either the dissent or the majority opinion, then you're going to be telling a particular story that is governed by all of these incentive structures slash legacy concerns slash other things. And I guess I wonder, how do you get to some productive use of history that is ethical in the context of knowing that history in an archive sense is not usually something that's actively applied. Like I can't just put that in a court case. So like, how do you think about the relationship between like the kinds of things that you did with Harper's Ferry with as practical application versus other kinds of practical application of history?
Sure. So historians are called as expert witnesses in cases. So in Obergefell, George Chauncey was called as an expert witness. So there are ways to get that information into the court record. And once it's in the court record, then appeals courts and whatever can use that information. But that's the work of the lawyers at the trial court level to know that and seek out the relevant information that they need to make their case. And then try and find creative ways, do that like evidence gymnastics to get what they want in the record by like doing depositions and like this is all during it's procedure stuff, but there are ways to get that in the record.
It actually reminded me of, all the testimony that's given in Congress, right? That information can be used in certain contexts to be able to supplement other information. And again, like, one of the reasons why I think this is valuable for people to understand isn't necessarily because I think everybody needs to be an expert on law or history, but because when we talk about things like complex systems, economic structures, cultural structures, uh, political structures, or government rule of law structures, all of those things are interconnected with one another. And understanding the different ways in which people tell stories within those different domains is really important to understanding how all these systems actually work. So, in order to be able to tell a convincing story with a world that you've built, you have to understand how these things intersect with one another and how decisions made in one part of the web will ripple to another part of the web and cause that to move as well. And so, even though I can understand why this would all kind of seem like 40,000 foot talk, like why does it matter what a Supreme Court justice says about any given thing, like that the ripple effect across all of these other elements of the way the world works they matter, right? Like, and I think this circles back also to the elements of what caused our understanding of queerness or transness to change over time. It's not because of one thing that happened. It's because of many different things, some of which were intentional, some of which were incidental, that caused all these ripple effects that caused a particular outcome. And I guess that's why I personally find history valuable, is because it helps us trace how those ripples happen.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It definitely does. And there are ripple effects, and things do take time to translate to society from wherever the heck they started. As you alluded to before, one example that I really like talking about is Germ Theory, that was published by Joseph Lister in 1865, and didn't like really functionally make a difference in anyone's life until like the 20th century, because people thought he was a crackpot. I was like, what the heck is this? This is ridiculous. Like, germs aren't real. Who cares? And then it took like decades for people to realize, oh, wait, maybe you're not an idiot. And stuff like that. So like, and with more relevant to the topic tonight, like the homosexuality was a term that was in use in Europe in the 1800s, like fairly not as unusual to hear or understand as it was in the United States. And it took time to adapt that here, to get that information, and then to apply it to people, to apply it to federal policies that we then see like took a while to trickle down and stuff like that. So that there's a lag. It's like dial-up.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true of how education works too. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's always like this 10 to 15-year lag between when something is sort of innovated and when it actually gets disseminated through the system to the point where it can be applied.
Frightfully frustrating.
It is incredibly frustrating.
And I think that's where some of the important work of public historians come in handy, because if they're the liaison between the academy and the public, then they can, by staying current, they can make more immediate impacts on people's understanding of like cutting edge history and stuff like that, like faster than waiting for a Texas school book company to put it in their like K-12 curriculum.
That is one thing that's kind of nice about the removal of gatekeepers on historical content like that, is that you're able to move away from a paradigm where only one set of states was able to decide what would end up in a textbook, and you sort of get a democratization of information. I had actually thought about asking you a question regarding Wikipedia, and because I have a feeling you have thoughts, TM, about Wikipedia, but more broadly than that, like, I'm kind of curious about how you think about the democratization of public history. And I mean, you talked about this toward the very beginning a little bit. But yeah, I mean, what does Wikipedia mean to you? Is kind of what I'm getting at.
Puts me in a cold sweat.
Yeah.
Wikipedia scares me. And I think not because all the content is bad, but I get maybe this is a personality thing. I just get really feisty with people who casually do things like they're okay. So whew, brain's going in 100 different directions. One of my grad school advisors made like Wikipedia nights, Wikipedia-thons, where we would like get pizza and sit in a classroom and just edit Wikipedia. So that was fun and nerdy. And I think indicative of like, yes, there is more people can create more content, and like historians and public historians have a legitimate space in the world because they're because we're trained to work with integrity and understand our biases and understand some of these missing pieces that maybe people don't understand, right? Like if you see if you go to a historic house and there aren't like slave cabins around the plantation home, then maybe some random person would think, oh heck, what are people talking about? This is all whatever conspiracy they want to say about slavery and that kind of thing. But if you're and that's I don't think that happens anymore. But if you're trained to question, then you get at a more informed. So maybe I will come to the same conclusion as somebody on Wikipedia. That certainly happens. But I have behind me maybe a lot more supporting evidence. That creates a fuller and more stable foundation, so that when people ask questions like, did Brown v. Board overturn Plessy? I can say, ha ha ha, I have an issue with that, and complicate the narrative a little bit more. Whereas like if somebody hadn't have done certain research or questioned certain things or addressed their biases, they might be like, yes, and then we'd be in a pickle, like what we're currently in.
I think that's an understatement to say that we're just in a pickle.
It is. I'm thinking of The Sandlot. If anybody thinks of that,
only one pickle, like
a whole jar of pickles. It's a grocery shelf of pickles, just pickles everywhere.
Yes, I think about this a lot. Well, I mean, for two reasons. One of them is because my hobby horse is disinformation, but also, I think about it in the context of the Holocaust and of climate change and of all of these other things that people have constructed alternate realities around. And sort of, again, like it's important for people to exist in society who fulfill this role of public historian for the purposes of protecting people from themselves and coming up with easy narratives to solve complex problems and essentially ward off the kinds of people who might put into Wikipedia something a little too simple to explain something that's a lot more complex than it may appear, like Brown v. Board or something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think I struggle with this. Maybe I'd probably make a pretty crappy high school teacher, because I think all of this nuance is so important, and at the same time, like young brains, they need a certain simplicity to the information that they learn so that they can have any toehold to then build on their bank of information. But I just feel like it's just more complicated than that, and I have a really hard time like peddling a truth to somebody without telling them all of these complications and caveats and things like that. So one of the groups that I worked with most at the park were 7th graders and 8th graders, so middle school kids who'd come to the park. We talked to them about John Brown and leadership, yada yada yada, super fun. And I think both that you need to simplify and young people are capable of learning more than we give them credit for. Like they can hold a lot more nuance than we tell them. And they should have that. Like they're smart little cookies. They should be able to learn critical thinking as they go and not just be fed these narratives that are kind of not true. And then they get to college and like me are like, holy shit, existential crisis. Like you mean to say that all that I've learned is wrong because you have all of these caveats to tell me that actually mean that the thing that I thought was true is not really true? What? Bad day.
That is a bad day.
It was a bad day. It's a bad semester.
Yeah. related, I don't want to go too much longer because we've been going for a while, and I don't want to put pressure on anybody to stick around. But one of the things that I had hoped to talk a little bit about was sort of how your personal history or personal narrative has been shaped by your understanding of history. So, how did you sort of, how has history sort of informed who you are and how you think about your own identity?
Yes, absolutely. Um, I I might very well be straight and cis if I didn't study the queers. I didn't. It was not something that I grew up with. It's not a thing that I learned culturally. Part of the reason why I wanted to leave. And without, I think one of the most powerful things for me about history, about learning history, and about understanding history, is that everything is constructed. All of this is made up by people. Some asshole hundreds of years ago decided this should be a thing, and so now it's a thing. Why did that person get to decide? I don't know. But here we are now, and this is how we live. And so if Joe Schmo, like 300 years ago, could decide that this thing should be a thing, then that means that I can decide that I want something different to happen. Because it's not a fundamental truth to like human existence. But it's made up, like that I learned that the gender binary was created by people, by my government. Game changer. Like, holy shit, so I don't need that. Great. Out the door. Bye. See you later. Like it felt really empowering to understand that history and our way of life and our systems of living are created by others for us. And I don't like being told what to do. You know this. And so I want to not do the things that the government tells me to do. Like pick a gender. And so I don't. And I think my own study of history has absolutely informed, maybe not my identity and where I've landed in this particular moment in my life, because like who knows, maybe it'll change later. But has absolutely opened up the possibility that I don't have to do what I was told when I was 2. I can do something different if I want, because it's all made up anyway.
I relate to that. And I think
Big mood.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I know for myself, a lot of, particularly the last 5 years, had highlighted how much of so many of these institutions and structures were made up, and that the when the guardrails came off so many of them, it became obvious that it was okay, that the world wouldn't end if we changed the way that these things were organized or curated or sort of pushed on individuals.
There,
So, yeah.
ooh, I have a quick, maybe it's not quick. I have an anecdote. That when I was at the National Museum of American History, there was the unveiling of like the Innovation in America exhibit. And it was a big deal. It's like the entire wing of the museum was redone as a permanent exhibit that's going to be there. So if you go to the National Museum of American History when it opens again for people, you can see this exhibit. And my supervisor wouldn't go in, like refused to go look at this exhibit, because it so it reeked of like a capitalist agenda, and really only told this. It told bad history. It told really bad history. And I say that because it ignored like the impact and whatever of like enslaved peoples and slavery, and things like that, and the way that those folks like built all of this stuff, and I think that like that people go and have really transformative experiences in museums and interact with history and have really profound moments with it and have these big aha realizations. Part of what is so impactful and part of what makes a historian's job so important is understanding that like unless I do a good job, like people are going to go home and talk about the things I say. And they're going to like maybe build their own identities or ambitions or dreams or whatever off of the words that I put on a piece of paper and show to them. Like that's a big deal. That's a hefty responsibility. And to do that poorly or to do that with such an incredible agenda that you don't actually do it right, is it's just big. It's a big deal.
It's like you were saying with the 1776 project, to sort of try to be a sociocultural offset of, you know, an actual research project. Like, this is the reason why I argue that there's overlap, regardless of what kind of instructor or teacher you are, whether it's in a K-12 school or you're a historian or you're somebody who's doing, you know, legal prep or whatever else, that there's some fundamental things about the way that we tell stories and the necessity of them being sort of honest, in order to preserve the integrity of how we think about all of these things. Like, it doesn't work if we allow the system to sort of, I guess, get corrupted by personal selfish motives, when it comes to how we tell stories.
I mean, I think humility should be a cornerstone in like everybody's work, and I think to the point that that Emily put in the chat, that like if we adopted like a style of humility and admitting that we're wrong, like publicly and nationally, like that's really important. Like I will say a thing about a history thing, hypothetically say a thing about a history thing, and if somebody shows me evidence and shows me like, oh heck, you ignored all this stuff, that totally upends the way that you think about that thing. Like, it's, even if I had an agenda, even if I had a bias, like I think one of the marks of a good and ethical storyteller, good ethical historian, is the ability to say like, oh crap, you're right. That does change the thing that I said. Let me look at things again, and reimagine like what truth is, because things do, like, I would love for there to be such an influx of material culture. God, I love material culture, that it just upends everything I thought I knew about a thing. That'd be so cool if somebody found stuff like that that forced us to further confront the fabrication of our like lived experience, which is a really maybe I just really like to be in existential crises all the time.
I relate to that thoroughly. It's so I'm gonna sort of close out with a thought about how that's particularly relevant this week, as we've just witnessed a really important trial after a year of protest and a essentially, yeah, I mean, years, as a culture have sort of become traumatized and numb to certain kinds of behavior, but also are seeking a better version of this reality. Like, this is where I think the storytelling piece that's just about how do you construct a beginning, middle, end story that's functional for a K-12 student to be able to explain fundamentally what happened up until this point in history, where that converges with there are lived consequences to history and that it is an active, evolving thing that is going to keep moving like a river. And so this week, I think, is a really good example of why the stories we tell matter and how they intersect in so many different ways between history and law and politics and economics and culture. Like, all of these things converge in such interesting and important ways. And so, I guess I would end by asking, do you have any parting thoughts regarding sort of the outcome of the trial this week, or about the BLM movement, or any of the other movements that have sort of cropped up over the last few years that are sort of emblematic of this push and pull between different versions of history?
Yeah, I think my parting thought would be to push back against the idea of cropped up. Like, through storytelling, we're taught that the movement history, right? The mid 20th century, that was when movements happened, like the gay rights movement and the civil rights movement and the battered women's movement, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Civil Rights Act was passed, and the Violence Against Women Act was passed, and the end. And now we have new movements that are cropping up in response to new things. Like, no, it's not new. It's not new. It's an extension. It's an adaptation of things that people have been saying forever and always. That, that was a sweeping generalization. That have been like there are folks who have been addressing systemic injustice continuously, and it's fallen out of the popular discourse. It hasn't gone anywhere. It is newly widely relevant to who controls the story making on the national stage. But those conversations weren't ever not a thing. There were always people who were fighting against like police breaking up gay clubs. Like that existed in the 1910s. It existed in the 1880s. Like that was the quote that I read about fairies, where that investigator like went to the hall. That was in 1889. Like people have always fought oppression. God, one of the myths I hate the most is that Abraham Lincoln is the great emancipator. Like that just ignores the agency of oppressed peoples and the ways that their fighting their oppression has always been a thing. Like that, maybe that's it. Maybe that's a human constant, that people will always fight oppression. We just might not pay attention to it. Boom.
That was a really good mic drop moment right there. I like that. It's a good one-liner. That's a tagline for this whole thing.
Yep.
It's fitting that you say that too, because I had said earlier today, I mean, you're right to call me on like not making it clear that these are constant struggles, not just one time you're one and done. But I had talked about potentially discussing MLK Jr. and the Poor People's Campaign and the relationship between civil rights movement and the feminist movement and the gay rights movement and organization of classes across a plurality of the population, as opposed to sort of these hegemonic minorities within society. And in order to get to the point where there are simultaneous conversations about Black Lives Matter, as well as trans rights and the unionization at places like Amazon and Bessemer, right? All of these different things, much in the same way as your opening slides illustrated how all of that stuff took place at the same time contemporaneously, and it was impacting, each element was impacting the other elements, influencing the other elements, maybe is a better word, is the same way that we are experiencing reality right now. And that
Yes.
in order for us to be better historical storytellers and ethical storytellers, we need to think about the context in which we are operating and how it is a complex system of interwoven parts, and how those things are necessarily tied to the same systems as they existed in the past, for better or worse. I mean,
Yes.
yeah. So
same adapted ancestors of the systems.
Yes.
Systemic ancestors, system, ancestral, whatever.
And perhaps one thing that is going to be different going forward is simply because there is this sort of wealth of information about individual people, we'll be able to do a better job understanding why people do the things they do, because now we have more artifacts to be able to sift through about individual thoughts and behaviors than maybe material culture was able to cultivate 500 years ago, 300 years ago, etc.
Perhaps. I mean, I think one of the I think these conversations, these like, aha, human nature is complicated and has always been complicated, people have been saying that for a real long time. But it's been in an insular, like in the like academic community, right? And so I think to a question earlier, like about more like diversity of people producing more things for the historical record, that there's an opportunity to spread that realization out to other people and to not just keep it within the walls of the academy, because like what the heck good does it do if just like 10 people in a room talk about, like, that doesn't functionally make a difference. And so
do history for the greater good is what you're saying. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to people about all of this information this wealth of information you have to provide.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate folks being here, asking
And
questions.
certainly if anyone has any follow-up questions or anything, I can forward them along, but we appreciate all of you who joined this evening to listen in. And if you are not somebody who is here and is instead listening to a recording of this, thank you for listening through the whole thing. And if you get to this point, congratulations. You've gotten to hear all about law and history and queerness and our thoughts on the Supreme Court. So there you go. It's a full evening of fun and excitement for everybody involved.
5 for the price of 1.
There you go. I'm going to end the recording now. So again, thank you to Nuri Sherif for joining us to talk about these things. And thank you to those who joined in to ask great questions and participate. And have a nice evening.